And what's happening today is my friend Gerard Cosloy is on the show. He's also the guy who puts out my records over there at Matador Records, a label he helped found with a guy named Chris Lombardi. He's also a one-time editor of a fanzine called Conflict and another label. And we get into all that in the interview, so I'm going to let the interview speak for itself. Before I get into the interview, though, I just want to relay a little bit of an anecdote about Gerard Cosloy to kind of put him in perspective as a kind of cool, influential person. A couple years ago, when Fucked Up and Jay Reatard were both kind of happening to be signing contracts with labels at the same time, you know, Jay signed to Matador first, and I remember talking to him about it, being like, so what was it about Matador that made you want to sign to that label? You know, like expecting here, you know, oh, you know, they put out this record or this, that, and the other thing. And he just said simply Gerard Cosloy. You know, Gerard's the coolest. You know, he'd always been fascinated by Gerard and always thought it'd be cool to be on a label run by Gerard. And you know what? I kind of feel the same way as Jay did. I've always wanted to be on a label run by this guy, Gerard Cosloy, and hopefully you kind of see why in this interview. Now, this is going to be part of a much longer series of interviews, I think, because we only get up to him moving to New York. You know, we barely touch on his career as like sort of this label wonderkin for, you know, the last few years in indie rock. We mainly just talk about Boston hardcore and growing up listening to punk at the inception of kind of punk happening in Boston. Generally have a pretty good chat with each other. Before I let you listen to that interview, I do want to talk about one more thing, and that is an amazing 3-disc compilation that I recently got, Native North America on Light in the Attic Records, Volume 1, Aboriginal Folk, Rock and Country, 1966-1985. This is an incredible set. I have not stopped listening to it since I got it. It's definitely my record of the year. It's an area of music that I knew virtually nothing about, and an area of music that I'm now trying to learn as much as I can about. It deals with First Nations people's music history. It's something that is criminally overlooked, as I mentioned, by myself especially, and it's something that hopefully this box set does a great deal in raising interest for this kind of you know, great depth of music that's out there. I cannot recommend that you pick this up enough. As I said, it is my record of the year, and thank you to Light in the Attic for giving me this, because I love it. So onward to Gerard Cosloy, owner of another record label that you should also buy records on, because my band's on that. Matador Records. Here it is. Damien, take it away.
Hey, how's it going?
Great.
Awesome. It sounds perfect on my end, too. You sound great. Sounds like audio fidelity kicking it large.
Excellent.
Proud enough to release. It sounds like an Earls and Jensen record.
Perfect.
So, thanks so much for doing this, man. Like, I know you don't really do too many interviews and stuff, so I really, really appreciate you doing this.
I feel like I do them all the time, but they're usually awful, and hopefully no one ever sees them. So,
well, let me tell you, because of the internet, they never go away. Yeah. But Conflict, you can't find Conflict anywhere.
Well, I wish that were true. I don't know if you're familiar with the gentleman who does the fucking record reviews blog.
Oh no! Oh yeah, he posts like he does. He just posts the reviews though, right?
Yeah. Well, occasionally other stuff too, like letters, or I don't know if he's got.
Oh, I got to go through that.
But he's very fond of taking bits from 80s or 90s zines and republishing them online. And I have to say, he's done a pretty good job of picking out.
The things you wouldn't want.
No, he's well, yes, he's definitely picked out things I wouldn't want anyone to see ever again. But he's kind of leaned more towards the things that, I mean, I think the era in which Conflict was actually readable was an extremely brief window in time, and I'm grateful that that's the stuff he seems to fixate on rather than the stuff from 1979 or 1980. So,
well, are you ready for us to start? Because like this leads into like so many of the things I wanted to talk about anyway. But are you ready to start the interview?
Yeah, sure, of course, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to do a preamble beforehand, but explaining everything and tagging it like they do in all these podcasts as we all listen to. Yeah. Basically, this is a wrestling podcast, but about punk instead of wrestling. But I've just like modeled it on Colt Cabana's podcast and on like. all the wrestling podcasts that you and I listen to in our secret lives. But I can keep kayfabe if you don't want to talk about pro wrestling or sports.
I'll talk about whatever. We're on the record, man.
All right. Well, that's awesome. So, Gerard, first, man, thank you so much for talking to me. Been a huge fan of you for a long time, and now I guess you're kind of my boss.
If only I were your boss.
Yeah, if only. But more or less, you're as much a boss to me as Much Music was. And mind you, they just fired me, so maybe I shouldn't be talking about them at all. But I just want obviously you're someone that was there kind of like at the onset, certainly of hardcore, but definitely of punk too. So you kind of got, a chance to see everything. But I start basically every episode off the same way, which is, so how did you get into punk? How did you discover punk rock?
Okay. I grew up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, the western suburbs, about 20 miles northwest of Boston, in a fairly well-to-do suburban town that didn't have many poor people or minorities or many weirdos for that matter. And at a pretty early age, I was interested in music, in popular music, and that was a long-standing sort of fixation for me. And at some point, I'm going to guess. This is probably, I'm going to guess maybe around 1977, there was a publication that my uncle gave me. I had my dad, his younger brother was about 10 years his junior, was, more of a hippie and a pot smoker in his day. Gave me a publication that he had picked up in Cambridge, a magazine called Hot Gorilla, which I don't know how long it lasted. I couldn't really tell you much about the genesis of it, but I do remember they wrote about a lot of hard rock stuff at the time, and there were numerous references in the publication to a band called the Sex Pistols and a band called the Ramones, and
So were you familiar at all with the Real Kids, or is that pre-Real Kids?
At that point, no. At that point, I was sixth grade. I had zero. I mean, my knowledge of what was happening at the club level was in Boston or the East Coast. It was a vague room. Like
every sixth grader's knowledge of what's happening at the club level in their local town, or
I'd started reading things like the Boston Phoenix and the Real Paper and stuff like that, but even then, it was very hard for me to differentiate between what was good, what was bad, and what was really, I didn't really have much of a handle on it. And anyway, this publication began talking about these bands, and it was for me it was like, wow, I was instantly very, very curious. And I moved to my family moved to Minnesota in 1977. We were living in another kind of tony suburban town called Edina, just outside of Minneapolis. And it was at that point that reading things like Cream and Rolling Stone, and Cream was a big early influence on me, that you began seeing more detailed coverage of things like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols, and then later on Clash, Talking Heads, Devo, et cetera, and this was at that point it's wow, how do I hear these bands? Where's hear stuff like this? And when I was in Minnesota, there was a band, a Minneapolis band called the Suicide Commandos.
Absolutely, yeah.
They were able to. They opened for Elvis Costello at a show in Minneapolis, which I did not attend. And I'm at this point, it's I really want to know more about this stuff. And we moved back to Boston very shortly afterwards. We were only in Minnesota for about 9 months. And I got back to Boston, and through reading Hot Gorilla, there's a radio station in Cambridge called WTBS that is playing this music. And WTBS was the college radio station for MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and their 10-watt radio station apparently has at least one radio show that's playing the quote-unquote punk rock.
We've actually played a live session at that station, so they still have.
Oh yeah, no, it's still
one or two shows.
It's actually over the last 40 years. I mean, it's been one of the most important college radio stations.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, so yeah, it's like I really want to know what the hell's going on at this radio station. And the thing is, I've got my dad's old stereo in my room, and it's got like a weird, like a kind of cable antenna that I gotta put up to the wall. And at certain times of the day, I can barely pick up, WTBS. I mean, it's like a weird crackle or whatever. And, on Saturday afternoons, I'm like constantly readjusting this antenna to try to hear what records are being played. There's a dude who's got a radio show called the Demi Moan. A fellow named he went by Ed Hyson, who went by the stage name of Oedipus. And I mean, the legend is that this is essentially the first so-called punk rock radio show in America. I don't know if that's true or not, but at the time, you could have fooled me. He's been doing the show since '76. It's claimed to be the first place in America where Piss Factory got played on the radio. The first place in America where the Damned and the Clash and Richard Hell got played on the radio. I don't know if that's actually accurate or not, but for that region, it was certainly the first place where those things got played. And yeah, I mean, hearing his show was an absolute mind blower. And then I later found out that there were other stations like that. I mean, one of the great things about growing up in Boston was that we had tons and tons of high quality college radio. You had WERS at Emerson, WZBC at Boston College, HRB at Harvard, where our friend and colleague Patrick Amory was music director for a number of years. MFO in Medford. There were smaller outlets, even at things like Brandeis and some of the high school stations. And yeah, so beginning to sort of like scour the dial, kind of at random, just looking for stuff. All of a sudden there's this entire crazy world opening up where it's not just the Clash and the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, but it's things like the Rentals and Throbbing Gristle and Perubu and the Fall, and it's like wow, this is crazy, and this is like 1978 or so, and
you were so young, to be getting into this journey also on your own too.
Yeah, but I mean, it was fun. I mean, it was for me, it was like this huge sort of lightning bolt. I mean, I'm not going to say that I no longer had any other interest in traditional musics or whatever, but at that point in time, like the sort of like the bloat of like album radio stuff. Whatever was sort of like the big, cultural music of that moment, Zeppelin, Aerosmith, Pink Floyd, the Who, et cetera. At that moment, it really felt like there was this big line in the sand, and zines, began to have a lot to do with it. Trying to get closer to Cambridge and Boston became a big deal to me, not the least of which because I could hear WTBS better if I was in Cambridge. I could pick up the signal a lot better. And so, I would go into town and, even like what you would consider to be like the not so cool record stores. There was a couple of stores in Harvard Square. I wish I could remember all of their names. There was a Strawberries, which was a horrible chain owned by the infamous Mo Levy of Roulette and Buddha fame. There was I wish I could remember the name. There were 4 or 5 record stores in Harvard Square, and a couple of them had these things that I guess you would call fanzines. I mean, aside from selling Rolling Stone and Cream, some of them had this publication called Boston Groupie News.
I've definitely heard of that.
Which, the name does not sound particularly enticing.
No.
But you pick it up, and there's black and white photography of, the Boston bands of that period. And they covered a pretty wide swath. It was everything from, La Peste, the Neighborhoods, the early days of Mission of Burma, to like the more sort of, I guess, kind of like poppy, new wavy things like Pastiche and New Miami and whatever. And they would do stuff on touring bands as well. Mm-hmm. But the main focus was local talent. all of whom were playing clubs I couldn't get into.
Yeah, like, would you be able to see any of these bands live at this point, or like, no? I guess it's everything.
At that point,
Rat.
Not. You know, I mean, I'm 13 years old, and the all ages show phenomena had yet to begin.
Yeah.
The first show I got to see that could call, you know, punk rock was at the Harvard Square Theater in February of '79, I'm thinking.
So it's after you started the zine?
No. The zine started towards the end of around November, December of '79.
Okay. So this is just way before.
Yes.
Or the year.
So so February of '79. It's the Clash, Bo Diddley, and the Rentals at the Harvard Square Theater, which was a movie theater in Harvard Square, maybe about 1,200, 1,300 capacity. First U.S. tour for the Clash. They also did, they did both coasts and whatever. But that was the first, I guess you'd call punk show I ever saw.
If only young Gerard knew then that he would grow up to be part of the label that put out that Rentals first 7-inch, or at least licensed it in the UK, right? Beggars licensed that Rentals 7-inch in the UK.
Yeah,
Crush.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, well, hey, that's why you're doing this interview with me, the nerdiest nerd to ever.
Yeah, that's amazing. I completely spaced on that. That Rentals record. But yeah.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, that was like an amazing thing because not only were the Clash still pretty exciting live band at that point in time, but also like being in a room with that many other people who were either curious and or fully immersed in that stuff. That was also a first time occasion. So just like the clothes alone, like what? Like wow.
Did you go by yourself? Did you know any other young people at that point?
I had a friend. I had a friend named John Hoyt, who was a friend of mine in Wayland High School, who he was also kind of curious about this stuff. I don't think he had the bug nearly as I did. But he was certainly, a lot more curious and open-minded than most of my peers at the time. And, so he went with me to the show. And,
was it a scared straight moment for him? Did he stop going to shows? Because I think we all have those friends.
I think he went to a few more afterwards. I don't think it was, he's a great guy. I just don't think it was the same, I don't think it was the same thing for him. That's not for me to say. He might to this day, he might be telling his grandkids about it right now. So.
Yeah,
I can't. That's true. I should put words in the mouth of someone I haven't talked to in 30 years. But that was, and I think, from that moment on, it was kind of like, wow, I need to kind of, figure out what the hell's going on here, and at that point, trying to figure it out was equal parts exciting and frustrating. Because, like I said, you couldn't, at that age, you couldn't get into shows. Mm-hmm. The only shows you could get into were the things that were playing at larger theaters and whatnot, and a lot of the more interesting bands of the period were not big enough yet to play places as big as where the Clash were playing. And it's the pre-internet era, and so you're spending a lot of time in record stores, fighting over a very limited quantity of stuff that the person at the store maybe didn't want to bring in. So but it was a great town to learn about that stuff in, because as I said, between all the colleges there and all the young people there, there was sort of a history of and a history going back much further than I was aware of. Mm-hmm. A history going back to the Velvet Underground playing shows in Boston and drawing more people than they did in New York. Boston definitely had a really, really cool history as a music town that predated punk, and I guess postdated it too. So
it didn't really have though that big first wave kind of punk scene that some of the other big U.S. cities had. Was it more because you think it was like a Boston rock town?
Well, I guess we get into the whole thing of what's punk and what's rock.
Yeah,
and how hung up do you want to be on the identity politics of all of it? Because you look at a lot of the great music that happened in the Boston area in the early 70s, and you look at like the Modern Lovers, why aren't the Modern Lovers considered the first punk band?
No, I would definitely consider them, but almost like after sort of the Modern Lovers, and then you have like sort of that first sort of Rat Records kind of third rail kind of scene, but you don't really, with the exception of maybe La Peste, and then you get Mission of Burma and stuff, but you don't really have that like New York or L.A.
Well, it's interesting because I mean, I think there's all kinds of historic reasons why Boston bands had a harder time breaking through nationally, internationally than those other cities. I mean, the fact of the matter is they're 4 hours away from New York. New York is a big media capital. It's the fashion capital. It's the arts capital. The world looks at New York, and to this day, the world still looks at New York as, hey, what's happening here? Boston has never, ever been accorded that kind of respect. And I'm not saying it should. It's just that's kind of the way it is. And I mean, even during that period you're talking about, I mean, you had the Real Kids, you had DMZ, and somebody could, make an argument that those bands were every bit as good as bands from New York or LA, but they were not entirely well connected. They may have had any number of personal issues. And then, you have that whole thing of, the major label signs a band from Boston, the record tanks, and all of a sudden, don't sign any more bands from Boston.
From Boston, yeah.
The Cars were the band that blew up big, to the extent that they were actually representative of anything happening within the scene. Can be argued back and forth. They're getting signed and they're getting big. It absolutely resulted in other bands getting signed, but it didn't necessarily mean anything good happened. I mean, that Nervous Eaters record on Elektra is kind of, I mean, there's some great songs on it, but
it's not.
Yeah, it's not as good as what they did before. It's not as good as what they did afterwards. So
yeah. Well, one band that you did, La Peste was. Did you buy that single when it first came out? Was that something that you felt like, because you reissued it ultimately, right, on Matador?
Yeah, we did a reissue of we did a full album of that single. Other studio stuff and from the period.
And live stuff, I think, on it?
Yeah,
too,
I think so. We didn't take any of the material. We didn't do anything with any of the material like post Peter Dayton, because there was the period where Peter left the band and went solo, and we kind of went for like a more kind of new wavy thing.
Didn't they become Kurt something or another name?
No, his records came out as Peter Dayton. I think
as Peter Dayton.
You might be thinking of Mr. Kurt from past.
That's what I'm thinking of. Sorry.
Yeah, which is a totally different
thing.
But yeah, Peter had a solo record that local publicity lady put out that actually got some commercial airplay and whatever. But it's a very smoothed over record. I mean, it's not without merit. It's not nearly as exciting as the stuff he did with La Peste. And La Peste got a different singer and guitar player, and the stuff they did post Peter was actually pretty good. But is kind of been forgotten in history. I mean, they never made any records with the later lineup.
But so was that a band that you ever got to see, or was that like obviously they were playing for Brad?
I didn't get to see them until much later on after Peter had left. And, I mean, they were still, like I said, like a really exciting live band, but I never got to see them with Peter Dayton, which is certainly frustrating.
So when did it transition to hardcore? Like, when did that movement for like the more sort of younger, faster kind of wave of kids start showing up? Because you would have obviously been there too, right? Seeing that happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's excuse me if I get any dates wrong here, because I'm really trying to go back and
yeah, like obviously speaking in general, you can talk in generalities. There was some awareness on the East Coast of certain things that were happening out in California, not with any great detail, but I mean, Slash Magazine existed, No Mag existed, and there were certain things that we were beginning to hear. I mean, we got to hear, certainly through the auspices of things like WMBR and those other stations. We got, everyone got to hear, the earliest X records, the earliest Black Flag stuff. But the real thing that kind of kicked the door open in a big way, and again was kind of like another one of these line in the sand moments, was the Dead Kennedys, probably, because they were beginning to get college radio play in New England long before anyone started using the word hardcore. Was Holiday in Cambodia the first single? No, isn't the one with police? I'll check right now. We can edit this part.
California Uber Allies. Was that the first single?
I think that's the first single. Yeah, it's California Uber Allies and the B-side's Police Truck, I think, or something.
California Uber Allies, was getting played on WMBR pretty early on.
Yeah, that's 79. It comes out too.
And at that point, nobody was talking like, oh, well, this is hardcore now. Now we're in hardcore. Yeah. It was like, all of a sudden, but that record was super popular. Everything they did subsequently was super popular. And the first time the Dead Kennedys came to the East Coast, I don't know if it was the first time or the second time, but at least the first time they played Boston to any large group of people. They played. They did a show at Emerson College in like one of the student union ballrooms there, and Biafra, who was his very loquacious self, he went on the local radio station. We had a big commercial radio station in Boston called WBCN that's no longer around. But during its heyday, it was probably like one of the biggest album rock radio stations in the country in terms of influence, ratings, etc. And their history is a really weird one because at some point in the 1960s, when the strictly formatted album rock radio stations began going freeform, somewhat inspired by FMU of its day, those stations began hiring away DJs from college radio stations and putting them on the air. Mm-hmm. And that trend was pretty much dead by the early 70s. However, WBCN still kind of kept remnants of it. Their talent pool was constantly being refreshed by the various voices from the local college radio scene. And a lot of them were influential college radio DJs from places like WMBR, WERS, mostly MBR, actually graduated to like pretty influential paying positions at WBCN. And the guy I mentioned earlier, Oedipus, who was the fellow who did the first show on TBS, which later became MBR, he began doing a Sunday night, sort of, I guess what they call a specialty show on WBCN before they eventually moved him into prime time, and then they eventually made him music director and then program director. He may have even been general manager of the station towards the end. It's weird. This guy being the first person to ever play, Piss Factory on the radio, to being one of the most influential guys in the American radio industry. But
that's kind of the way it goes with punk, like, and there's just so many people that went from that initial kind of spark of hearing it to so many weird random places.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, to get back to Biafra,
the
went and guest DJ'd on this guy's show on WBCN, on the commercial radio station. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like mind-blowing, if you could imagine this happening today. Biafra comes on, and he's going to play like a bunch of records he's brought with him. And, he's playing, like, he plays the Bad Brains' Pay to Come. He plays the Feeders', Jesus Entering from the Rear. He plays Flipper. He plays Half Japanese. And he plays Black Flag. And it's like, holy fucking shit, what's going on here? It's like, it's one of these, say what you will about Jello. I know not everyone, loves him, and I haven't always I haven't always been very nice to him, but that
he definitely does not forget bad conflict reviews. I'll tell you that much. I love Jello, but he definitely
I did something to Jello much worse than a bad conflict review. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. Anyway, this was like, I would say this ranked pretty high on one of those like, holy shit, like what the fuck have I been doing with my moments, where like I'm like, hey, I'm cool. I've heard I've heard Spandau Ballet, whatever. You hear Flipper's Love Canal, on a commercial radio station, and it's like,
that's crazy.
Jesus Christ, this is incredible. So
was that like? So this music hit you harder than the punk you had heard previously, or was it just like?
I would say it kind of hit me the same way. Obviously there were differences about it.
Yeah.
I don't think there was any part of me that was like, well, That's the only kind of music I like now. From now, this is music and everything else sucks, man. I mean, to Jello's credit, he was not particularly hung up on labels, categories, fashion, whatever. I mean,
that Let Them Eat Jelly Beans comp is really reflective of like a diverse palette as far as like underground music goes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, essentially, when he did this guest DJ thing, he was essentially playing almost everything he put on that comp, and that comp was incredibly influential. Just shining a spotlight on all kinds of stuff. And I mean, the fact that he would play Half Japanese alongside those bands, I think, is an indication that he was not hung up on, am I hardcore or am I not? I mean, Jello was at the time a big supporter of the Freeze, and the Freeze could not have been more sort of, unhip with like the Boston intelligentsia insider scene.
Well, when does that that Boston hardcore crew kind of like, when does that first start? The Boston crew starts showing up.
Again, I'm going to be a little fuzzy on the dates here, but I remember seeing a classified ad in the Boston Phoenix, and this guy, a guitar player, he's trying to start a band. And, he's into, Black Flag, Dead Kennedys, UK Subs. I wish I could remember what else he had in there. And I called the guy up, and we talked for a little bit. And it's pretty clear after about 3 or 4 minutes on the phone that we're not going to start a band together. We're kind of coming from pretty different places on the map musically. And, we say our goodbyes. And I guess about a month later, Black Flag did their first U.S. tour. They did 2 shows at the Paradise, which is a kind of corporate rock club in Allston. They did an all-ages show and then an over-20 show at night. And I went to soundcheck, which I used to do a lot in those days. God knows what I was thinking. Going to soundchecks by choice.
I would do that too.
I mean, I did it a lot because it was the only way I could get in. So
yeah.
It was a 20 or 21 and over show. Going to soundcheck was the only way I could get in because you'd hide somewhere for 5 hours. You'd hide in the dressing room, hide in the kitchen or something. But yeah, went to meet the Black Flag guys, some of whom I'd been corresponding with. And, there's this guy there. It's a big tough looking dude with, leather jacket and studs and whatever. And, it's Al, the guy from the ad.
Yeah.
That's Al. So, Black Flag played this show and there may have, maybe 30, 35 people at this show. And I think fewer for the over 21 show afterwards. But, it was very shortly after that, Al's got a band together. Al's got this band. They're called SSD Control, and Springer is the singer. And everybody knows Springer. Springer is like a fixture at every gig in Boston, like forever, like pre-punk. Springer's. He's my age, but you see him at every fucking show, no matter what. Like big shows, small shows, doesn't matter. He's at every gig. Yeah. And, huge music fan, real, larger than life personality, super, super funny guy. And immediately it's like, wow, this could be pretty interesting because this guy Al certainly seems to mean business. And Springer has always kind of had the makings of what could be a great rock frontman. Yeah. So, but even all of that said, none of that really prepared anybody for how amazingly good those guys were right off the bat. And things completely exploded when they first started playing out. From that moment on, the crowds at those shows began getting bigger and bigger. People started forming other bands immediately. I'm not saying that every band formed in the wake of SSD. Certainly, obviously the Freeze didn't. The Freeze predated them by a pretty wide margin. But, there were a ton of other Boston bands that started in the wake of what Al had gotten going. And that was probably a big moment for people maybe younger than me or people who hadn't been into music as long, just because, the same way, at least for me, like hearing the Ramones or hearing the Clash for the first time, it's like, well, you don't need to go to the Berklee School of Music. You don't need to have great gear. It's about imagination. It's about guts. It's about, it's about bringing something of yourself, even if it's primitive. It can still be really great. You can still make art, even if you don't have an art degree.
Yeah.
And SSD kind of did the same thing, but they made it far more accessible and relatable for a lot of the kids. I mean, I think at that point I was probably more of a bourgeois, sort of art kid that was not part of their constituency. I mean, I went to the shows, I bought the records, I was certainly interested in what they did, but I was never ever down with those guys. I was never a member of the crew, as it were.
So you're not charging up the steps in Kids Will Have Their Say?
I'm definitely not charging up the steps at any of those shows at Gallery East or places like that. I was one of the dudes all the way in the back, all the way in the back, standing on the stairs or in a corner or whatever, just hoping I didn't get my ass kicked. That's.
Well, I want to ask you about Mission to Burma too, because they were obviously a huge band for you and stuff like that. When did you first come in contact with them?
The first time I ever heard of them was reading Boston Groupie News, where they would get mentioned in passing. And, radio tapes were a big phenomenon in that era. Well, not every band was putting out, CDs didn't exist yet, and not every band had the means to put out their own records. There were very few, quote-unquote, established independent record labels, and the few that did exist, were putting out tons of records. So if bands wanted to get known, they would make demos at one of the cheaper studios in town, and then they would send the demos. They would send their quarter-inch tapes. They would actually send the quarter-inch tapes to a WMBR or WZBC, and those stations would transfer those tapes to carts. And those carts would get played on those radio stations as much as popular records would. And, a lot of the big, sort of Boston punk and new wave, quote-unquote hits of the era got their start as demos made for those radio stations.
I think that's Rock from the Tombs too. That recording, that Rock from the Tombs, the Cleveland band, right?
Yeah.
I think theirs was a radio cart thing. That only recording that exists.
This even went on into the hardcore era, where a lot of the songs that were commonly thought to be the band's signature song did not get their start as an actual record. You heard them a year earlier as a radio cart. In the case of SSD, How Much Art, the radio cart version of that is very, very different than the version that's on the Kids Will Have Our Say, and I think you could argue it's a superior version. But that was something that made a huge impact long before they got things together to actually make a physical record. But getting back to Burma, that was kind of how they made their mark. A lot of the songs that got people really, really interested in them were in circulation on those stations long before they had a record out. So songs like Peking Spring, Academy Fight Song, those songs were being played. There was probably a good 6 or 7 songs that everyone knew because they were being played on those stations. And and you would tape them. You would sit with a cassette recorder plugged into your receiver, and your finger on the pause button, waiting for the song to come on, and you'd record them so you could listen to them later on. That's how we did it. And
I kind of caught the tail end of that too, because I was still in the era where you would tape things off community radio that you wouldn't be able to hear otherwise, type thing. So I definitely remember that feeling of anticipation, nervousness, trying to hit play record at the exact same time, not to screw up your recording.
Yeah. So they were. Again, in their own way, they were a colossal eye opener because. Yeah. Certainly, there were things about them that were catchy and anthemic and bore relation to, the loud rock and roll that everyone loved. But there was a lot of things about it that were super different in terms of the presentation, in terms of, you get 3 writers, 3 singers, He had all the stuff going on with Martin Swope and the tape loops, which was a pretty bold thing to be trying at that point in time. The level of musicianship was sky high in a period where things were very, very primitive and not nearly so ambitious. And they had a lot of things in common with bands that were not considered punk or cool. I mean, you could actually, if you tried hard enough, you could draw a line to them in King Crimson. You could draw a line to them in Roxy Music. You could draw a line to them. You could certainly draw a line to them in the Stooges, which was a much cooler influence. But they had so much stuff going on, and they were completely fearless about it. There was not a single thing about them that was like, well, this is what we need to do to get played. This is how we need to look. They were very, they were very devoted to kind of creating their own language, and that was incredibly inspiring. I mean, they were a very charismatic band on the sort of the traditional rock band scale. Those guys were able to do the rock star thing without trying, and to their credit, they were never trying. I mean, they weren't trying at all. They were just naturally, a super exciting band with a load of personality, a load of charisma, and a load of ideas to spare. And for me, they were without question, they were my absolute favorite band of the period, and would probably go on to be my favorite band ever.
So they were like your touchstone band. Like, were they the band that everyone kind of galvanized behind too locally, or because
really they had a very devoted pocket of like friends, acolytes who went to every gig and knew the material religiously and made fun of them and gossiped about them, hung out with them and gave them shit and worshiped them and still gave them shit. I mean, they had their little family, but they were not the most popular local band in town. They weren't even the fourth or fifth most popular local band in town. And although the Academy Fight Song single did very, very well by 7-inch standards and actually got more than a little bit of airplay from that same like vaunted WBCN. It never really turned into anything bigger commercially for them. But when Versus came out, it was not nearly as well received nationally or even by like some of the bigger local press. It was a more difficult record to get into than the more sort of anthemic stuff like Revolver. And then they broke up a few months later. I mean, they broke pretty shortly after Versus due to Roger's his tinnitus. And they were not the band everyone galvanized around. I mean, they were more popular than most of the bands of that period. But like I said, they were not even like one of the top 5 or 6 most popular Boston bands. And I mean, history, revisionist history, like they played their farewell gig, their 2 farewell gigs in Boston were at the Bradford Ballroom. They did an all ages show.
Is that the one Negative Effects opened?
Yeah, that's the one. Negative Effects opened the afternoon show. They had the mini riot.
Yeah, were you at that show?
At the show, and then they played an evening over 20 show as well, and then they did a very ill-advised show opening for Public Image in Staten Island about a month later. That was the absolute final show, and that went quite poorly. But yeah, I mean, the Bradford shows were packed, and the Bradford was a big place. I mean, that was a 400 or 500 capacity place, and they sold out 2 shows, and it had the veneer of like, yeah, this is Boston's #1 band saying goodbye. But I mean, you announce you're never playing again, and a lot of people come out of the woodwork.
Yeah, everyone comes out for a funeral.
Yeah, that it was a big deal, but it was only a few months earlier that you could have seen them play in front of a much smaller crowd. And I'm not saying this to disparage them in any way. I mean, my feeling was they were the best bands on the planet, whether 20 people were there or 2,000. But
well, it's funny because like now we're in a world where like Moby's released a cover as a single, REM's done a cover, Anti-Flag. I got introduced to them through an Anti-Flag cover on the first Anti-Flag demo.
Yeah, I mean a lot of people went on to discover those records years later through any number of means, and that's cool. I mean that's people find great songs all kinds of ways.
Oh, absolutely. And they're one of those bands that I think, has been canonized now, at least. Like, there is, like, some sort of redemption in their story. Like, they became that legendary band. It just took a lot longer than probably should have done.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's for me, it's interesting because, they had the whole 19-year layoff. And, and then they come back. And, I was very, very nervous about the reunion. It was one of those things I never, ever thought would happen. There was probably a couple of times I wished it wouldn't happen because I was afraid of what it would be like. And when they did come back, it was stunning to me how good they were.
Absolutely. And those records, like those Matador records, are awesome.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the records they've made since leaving Matador have been awesome as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, those shows were those first batch of shows they did in 2002 after coming back. Were really good and had so many of the characteristics of what made them special in the first place. I mean, they weren't simply doing greatest hit sets. I mean, they were mixing it up. They were fucking things up. They were throwing in covers they shouldn't have played. I mean, it was very, very, very similar to what they were like the first time around. And then as more and more new material entered the set, then of course it changed a bit in the right kind of way. But yeah, I mean it's funny. There's that whole thing of like, how do you feel about like bands getting back together and who has the guts not to get back together?
Yeah,
and it's an interesting thing because on one hand, I can certainly think of a bunch of examples of bands who it was either a money grab or it was kind of embarrassing and they're trying to relive something and blah blah blah. And Burma was definitely one of the cases where. Not only was there total dignity to what they were doing, but it was super, super exciting. And I think the only thing for me that's frustrating was that that past has been so canonized and they're so recognized for Revolver and Academy Fight Song and all this music circa 79 to 1982 that a lot of people take them for granted what they're doing now. These guys are in their 50s. I don't need to hear what they're doing, and it's like, okay, fine, that's your loss,
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where like the biggest burden a band has is nostalgia.
Yeah,
like people's nostalgia for your old stuff. You're like, yeah, but I'm doing this thing. You should check it out now because in a couple years you might like it.
Yeah, I guess you can't have it both ways because if it's not for the nostalgia, you can't really charge anybody to get in. I mean, Burma couldn't charge $15 for people to see them, and they probably couldn't be traveling to different corners of the world if it weren't for those early records and that early reputation. If they weren't in Michael Azarad's book, they would have a hard time getting on an airplane and playing somewhere. I think they know that. At the same time, it's like no matter how good something that you did 30 years ago was, you don't want to be defined by that. If you're a real artist, you don't want that to be, the only thing you're known for and the only thing people appreciate. And I think there's all kinds of artists, big and small, that kind of go through that. I'm sure. I mean, I bet even for Neil Young, that must be like.
Oh, I'm sure he has. Like when Trans came out.
Yeah, or even. I mean, I saw a Neil Young show back in January. Where people paid like sick money to get in to see him play acoustic, and they're yelling out for songs.
Oh yeah, he hates that.
And he's like, I've been doing this a long time. I have a thing called a set list. You may not be aware. And people, they don't want to be the human jukebox. I mean, I don't know if you know. I don't know if you know Timmy Vulgar at all.
Timmy Vulgar.
Timmy from Human Eye and.
Oh yeah, I know Human Eye. I don't know.
He's like he's completely awesome. Like great musician, really amazing, crazy guy. I mean, I'm not like I'm friends with him or anything. I'm just a fan. And like last year, at some point last year, he went to see Wire play this like museum show in Detroit. It was like some like big ticket show in like an arts center or whatever. And he went to the show, I guess maybe not having listened to like the last 20 years of Wire.
Yeah,
and he was like, "Oh, awesome! They're gonna."
It's going to be Pink Flag. It's incredible.
Flag or whatever. And they get up there and they do the more sort of kind of Well, the sort of stuff that they do these days for the most part, and he's like, fuck these guys. They didn't take requests. Fuck them. These fucking jerks. We paid all this money to get in. Fuck. Fuck.
Well, there's that story, I think it's in America's Hardcore, about AOD taking Lars to see Black Flag and Lars heckling them to play faster. Because it's like process of weeding out era,
that's really
slow it down era,
yeah.
Black Flag. Well, talking about, audience reactions to shows, I want to actually find out about that Negative Effects Riot thing. What was your take on that? Because you were probably more of a Burma fan by that point.
I was more of a Burma fan, but I was definitely a Negative Effects fan as well. I got to see they didn't play a lot of shows, but I think I saw most of the ones that were in Boston at least.
Mm-hmm.
And, Choke was one of these guys that, if you spent a lot of time in town going to shows and buying records, everybody knew Choke. The same way everybody knew Al and everyone knew Springer. Choke was absolutely a fixture on the scene. You'd see him at a lot of gigs, mostly punk gigs, obviously, but you'd see him around a lot. And he did radio at WERS, the Emerson station. So
what was his radio show like?
I can't remember. I'm sure it was good, but I can't actually. Yeah. I'm not. I don't mean this as a diss. I just literally.
No. I can only imagine because I remember I had a zine that was the worst Choke quotes from other zines, and I could only imagine how long a Choke radio show at that point would have stayed on the air.
Yeah. Well, some of the guys in that scene had their little radio things going on, like Curtis, the guy who Later wanted to start Tang. Curtis got his start on WERS and had a falling out with that station over whatever. He and Dave Smalley went on to do a 15-minute radio show on WZC. When they left there, they may have resurfaced the NBR. Surely, that's the other thing that's weird. Is we keep calling it college radio. So many of the people who were involved with college radio in the Boston area were not college students.
Yeah, it was more community radio.
Things were very, very loose. While some stations had a very strict students-only rule, there were other stations that sort of looked the other way to put some weirdo on at 2 a.m. And I was a beneficiary of that. I got to do a show on ZBC for a couple of years, despite the fact I was still in high school. So there were definitely these weird things where somebody would say, well, we're going to put Curtis on the air even though he has nothing to do with his institution. We're going to keep this guy on the air until he's in his 60s because we think he's good. And again, that was cool. I'm not trying to say students shouldn't be on the air, but it was really great that you had all these radio stations that were devoted to letting these various degenerate record hounds play music rather than just be hey, I'm 18 years old. What came in the mail today?
Was it a record collecting lifestyle too? Were you guys digging stuff at that point? But at that point you would have been, I guess, through the zine exposed to stuff from all around the world. Were you aware of these little hardcore scenes and punk scenes happening internationally by that point?
Not to a super full extent. Again, there was a lot of things going on in terms of reading zines. Everyone read Flipside, everyone read Touch and Go. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people in the know would read these various zines, and you had your pen pals, and but it was not the level of trading and hoarding was not nearly as sophisticated as it is now. We didn't have the same tools at our disposal, but yeah.
Well,
sorry.
No, go on.
You would meet people in these various ways without ever meeting them. There'd be a lot of stuff where it's somebody would read your zine and they would say, "Hey, can you write for mine as well?" And you would start writing back and forth with them. And I got to know a lot of different people around the country that way. Barry Hensler was doing a zine in those days called Smegma Journal.
I heard there's a story about a person we both know paying, I think it's $1,000 for 2 issues of Smegma zine.
Wow, I wish. Wow. But I met, I can't remember.
And it wasn't me. I totally led you probably to believe that it was me. I swear it wasn't on me.
I couldn't even tell you exactly how I got to come into contact with Barry, but he and I began writing to each other and talking on the phone sometimes.
And it's pre-Necros probably, right?
Yeah, well, pretty much right, pre-Necros, and then they started shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
But I wrote a couple things for him. He wrote a couple things for me, And it was interesting because he was so much further advanced than I was. I mean, at the same age, his level of knowledge and his sort of bullshit detector was so much more refined than mine. It was, I wouldn't say it was intimidating. It was probably more inspiring than it was intimidating. But it was definitely kind of like, Jesus Christ, I need to kind of like up my game here. This guy knows way than I do about this.
Really?
Stuff. And he was connected. I mean, he knew so many people in the Midwest.
Well, I guess he was the guy that traveled. Was it him that traveled to the West Coast and brought back the hardcore records and the videotape footage that he shot at Black Flag? I think the legendary story.
Know that, but that could be true.
Maybe that was Corey. It's someone from that scene went out to LA.
I don't actually know that story. It's probably in Tony Redman's book.
Yeah, it is Tony's book.
But yeah, that's like, then he's the next thing, like a couple, shortly after, the writing back and forth with him, he's telling me about this band he's starting, and like, the whole, it was crazy. Like all these different people, who went on to do all these other amazing things. And, but yeah, I'm sorry, what was your question again?
Well, I was going to say, like, on some record nerd type shit. Were you at that Last Right show? Like,
I can. Yeah, well, let me finish about the Negative FX show. So
go on.
So they played, and I think, I don't know. I mean, Cho could answer this better than I could. I think there may have been some frustration that they didn't blow up a lot faster than they did. I mean, there was a period where they were on the shelf for a while because Choke broke his leg at a show in New York. There's a venue in Long Island called My Father's Place, and it may have been a Black Flag show. I'm not sure, but there was some gig that he went to there, and I don't know if it was like a Boston versus New York thing or it was just an accident, but he broke his leg at the show, and Negative FX went on the shelf for a while. And this was right at the time when things were really beginning to cook for them. And when they came back, Choke has got like the plaid, he's got the heavy plaid, and it's all this like lumberjack thing. And I think maybe he thought everyone was kind of going to fall in line, like everyone was going to start wearing a lot of like outdoorsman kind of brawny stuff. He was certainly ahead of his time. I think
he was definitely ahead of his time. It's like now he would have been like the king of Hamilton hardcore.
Absolutely,
like that's what everyone wears in Hamilton. That's like the Boston hardcore uniform these days.
Absolutely, it's amazing. If anyone could have known that like Eastern Mountain Sports was the maybe like ground zero for that look. It's like they're like the Vivian Westwood of their day.
Of their time, yeah.
But, so I mean, Burma did the last shows, and their whole thing was they didn't just want it to be about them. They wanted it to be kind of like an event that paid homage to the various things in Boston that they were into. And if I can remember, the other support bands that weekend were the Dangerous Birds, who were an all-female art rock band that were fronted by Talia Zedek, who later went on to front Uzi, Live Skull, Cum, and her own solo stuff. Really, really great band. Boston band called Christmas, who were one of my favorite bands, certainly not very popular at that period in time.
Well, you worked with them a lot. They were on Homestead, and you put them on. They were on the Comp too, right? The bands that could be God.
Yeah, they were never on Homestead, but yeah, they were on bands that could be God, and then they later
on Matador.
They had a posthumous third album on Matador.
Okay, sorry.
At which point featured James McNew on bass before he joined Yo La Tengo.
Yeah.
So yeah, Christmas were on those shows. The Proletariat from Fall River, Massachusetts were on the show. And then Last Rites. And Last Rites were probably the wild card out of the bunch because...
no, it was Negative FX then, right?
No, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. Negative FX, who were probably the wild card of the bunch because they were not like part of Burma's social milieu. I mean, I guess the Proletariat weren't either, but Proletariat had played with Burma enough times that nobody raised an eyebrow about them being on these bills.
So how did they get on the show? Was it like something like the club put them on, or the promoter? I mean,
Burma picked the band.
Oh,
Burma picked who was going to do these shows, and the Burma guys were fans of Negative FX. I mean, they knew the radio tapes. I mean, I think Peter was probably the biggest fan of the three. But I mean, they really wanted them on the show, so they were on the bill for the matinee, and that show was pretty packed. And I think it would be fair to say that a large portion of the kids who went to that show were not actually there for Burma, or at least they were primarily there for negative effects. Mm-hmm. And that made for a sort of a culture clash, because Burma's teenage fans were not necessarily the same folks who were going to the hardcore shows. And it wasn't like there was violence or anything. It wasn't like someone was getting punched or whatever because they looked wrong. But there is kind of like a vague sort of cliquishness thing of like, well, this is your pack and this is our pack. We're the folks,
different
we're the dudes in the hardcore, and you're the folks into the college rock art bag shit. If you'll excuse the vernacular,
the parlance of the day, I guess.
Yeah. So anyway, so the big day arrives, and Negative Effects go on, and they're playing. I mean, this is all, you can see the videotapes on YouTube.
Oh, I've definitely seen the videotape.
Immediately, the crew, their dudes, are up on stage, doing the thing, and venue security, what little there was, kind of flips out and starts trying to stop it and get in the way. And at one point, there's actual uniformed Boston police officers on the stage, wanting to pull the plug. There's somewhere out there, there's a photograph of Al, having a stare down with some 60-year-old truncheon wielding Boston police officer. It's this classic look of the kids versus the cops or whatever.
Yeah.
And, they were gonna shut the show down if this stuff didn't cease. And luckily the band didn't play a very long set, so that was it. But there were some ill feelings afterwards, because a lot of the folks who primarily paid to see Burma and wanted to see Burma didn't like having someone's boots landed on their head. Mm-hmm. And it's it was a big moment for them, either getting to see Burma for the first time or the last time or whatever. And the antics of Negative Ethics' buddies kind of pissed them off. And and conversely, I think those guys were like, you know what? Who cares? Fuck you.
Was it weird because you seemed like you were in the middle, kind of like a fan of both scenes? I guess Burma was too. Peter Prescott.
I was probably more sympathetic to the kids whose heads were getting landed on.
Okay.
Yeah, my feeling was, this was kind of
it was a Burma show.
It was a Burma show, and but you know what? It's like everyone paid to get in. In retrospect, everyone paid the same amount to get in. Yeah. Their cooler heads could have prevailed. You could have easily had people just go to the back and wait until Negative Effects were done. I don't know. It's just to this day, I feel like it's a difficult thing, because
I know exactly what it's like.
There are a lot of people out there who like the music, but they're not necessarily down with all the action that happens in the crowd, either because that's just not their thing, or because like me, they're 100 years old. There could be any number of reasons why.
At Matador 21, didn't you mosh for us one time?
No.
It was a blur. That entire weekend's a blur to me.
I'm pretty sure you've got me mixed up with some.
Maybe it's just like a Vegas-induced fantasy of you singing along to the Burma cover that we did.
Yeah, that's definitely, There's no video footage of this anymore.
There's no video footage. Another, I guess, speaking of Choke's next most infamous show around then, the Last Right show.
Yeah, Last Right. So
you were at that one and only kind of appearance?
Yeah, so they played at the Greenfield Grange was it the Greenfield? I'm trying to remember if it was or it was. I can't. We only had a couple of venues in Western Mass.
If Jonah was here, he would know.
There was the Greenfield Grange, and there was some other sort of church hall venue. This may have been the latter, because I think the owner of the Greenfield Grange was getting a little pissed off with scuff marks on the floor and the occasional beer ending up in the venue. But yeah, there was a show at this Western Mass hall. I believe it was Deep Wound, Siege, maybe the Outpatients, probably the Outpatients, and Last Rites. And this was, if I'm not mistaken, this was the only Last Rites show.
It is the only Last Rites show. I just busted out my 7-inch because I'm checking to see if they actually have the name of the club on the 7-inch, but it doesn't look like
so. So anyway, there's a lot of anticipation because, it's like Western Mass, for all of its wondrous music and culture, there was maybe, I think some of the folks were maybe slightly in awe of the Boston Dance.
Yeah.
Like, oh boy, here we go. Choke's coming to town. Let's bring out the welcome wagon. So the big day arrives, and first of all, Siege were amazing. That was the only time I ever saw Siege.
I was going to ask you about Siege after too.
They completely destroyed. And when the guy busted out the saxophone, that was like one of the sickest things that I've ever seen.
Why did you not get to see? Was that just before you moved to New York type thing, or
I was going to school at UMass Amherst at the time.
Okay, so you just didn't get a chance to see Siege as they kind of were happening.
Yeah, no. The only time I ever saw Siege was that Western Mass show. So
was it like that? Must have been like, because that's the thing I always wonder about, like Deep Wound and Siege. Those bands are just so much faster than anything else at that time. Like it just like it's almost like another level. Was it like? Did it feel that way at that time, or was it just like everyone was just trying to push that speed barrier? So it's just like another band doing fast hardcore.
Well, there was all kinds of things that went into it. I mean, yeah, I think part of it was the speed barrier. Everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people really loved Discharge.
Yeah,
that was a big thing that everyone really loved. But I mean, the dudes in Deep Wound were into all kinds of stuff. I mean, Charlie was a huge Hendrix fan. So
okay.
It was. Deep Wounds at the time, as great as they were, I think that was like, that could have been one of 5 bands those guys could have been in. If those guys had lived in a city with more musicians and more opportunities to do stuff, Deep Wound would have been like one of the 5 bands they were in. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, like those guys were all super talented in a million different ways.
And they all had like so many different ideas about things. Deep Wound was what brought all of them together.
Yeah,
I mean, like I said, like if they had been somewhere like like Austin right now or whatever, those guys would have been. Charlie would have been in 4 bands.
Well, even if you look at the breadth of music that like Jay and Lou would produce, and like even just Lou, the stuff in different genres of music that just Lou has done in different bands, and how much of an impact that has, and it's like, here are these people in this like little band from this tiny town outside of Boston.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I want to talk to you about Deep Wound in a second because you're their original manager, right?
Well, that was, but
anyway,
as Charlie said more than once, here's your little ego trip. I mean, it was not much of a management thing, but.
So did you ever were you booking them shows, or was it just like a ceremonial type?
There wasn't a lot of demand for shows, and yeah, I mean, I would try to get them shows, and I would try to get the record around and stuff. But it's like, my skills as a manager were beyond primitive, beyond pathetic. I was not much of a manager, at least not then.
Was that did you hook up them with Radio Beat Records out of Boston?
That had already happened. I mean, that
already happened.
My previous experience seeing Deep Wound was and they played a VFW hall in Cambridge. A show in Austin at a VFW hall. I had them open a show at the Channel, I think maybe for DOA or somebody. Uh-huh. And then I ended up going to school at UMass. And I was in the same dorm as Charlie. Jay's dorm was right across the hill from mine. Mm-hmm. And immediately started hanging out with those guys. Not that they hung out together all the time, but immediately started hanging out with those guys and offering to help out with stuff. But yeah, I mean, in retrospect, like calling myself a manager or even saying that they had a manager is kind of ridiculous. So.
It makes for a good footnote in the history of rock and roll, though.
But, I mean, just to be very clear, I did nothing. I did absolutely nothing of any value for them.
Well, you got a credit on the 7-inch. That's on that insert for
got my parents' phone number on the 7-inch. That's all that matters.
Well, there we go. That's now incentive for someone to pay $700 for the copy on Discogs right now.
Yeah,
of that single.
back. We keep getting distracted from this amazing Right story.
Yeah, I know.
So anyway, there's all this anticipation for Last Rites' big Western Mass debut, and like the younger kids are all really excited, and they pull into their van, and immediately there's kind of weird vibes because I think everyone kind of expected like they're going to get there and they're going to watch the other band and everyone's going to talk and hang out at the pool, and nothing like that is going on. They're just staying in their van. They're not coming out of the van. They're in the van. Everyone's kind of bummed out about it. So immediately there's kind of like a weird vibe. And then they eventually come out of the van, and Twisted William is wearing one of those Hitler European Tour T-shirts. Like a hush. It's like one of those scenes in like one of those like one of those movies where like the gunfighter walks into the old the music stops and everyone just goes hush. It's like the minute everyone sees the Hitler European Tour shirt, it's like, oh, those guys are nice. So that's kind of that thing. So they've come into town. And they've got like a bro tourage with them of like whatever, like 7 or 8 people. And they get up on stage and they start playing. And Choke has got this thing going on where, I don't know if you remember the period where Freddie Mercury used to wield like the
mic stand.
Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the half mic stand thing where he whips it around.
Like
absolutely.
Mic stand with no bottom end. So that's what Choke has. Choke has like a half mic stand thing going on. So they're playing, and their Boston buddies who come with them have got like a small pit going on, and it's going around and around, and they're kind of like doing like a semicircle coming off the lip of the stage. And one of the local kids, I wish I could remember his name. He was in a band. Probably 18 years old at the time, got a newish leather jacket on. He kind of gingerly joins the circle and cuts across the front of the stage. And Choke like sees him coming across and just lays him out. like bang. Like what? And it's like somehow even out of his peripheral vision, Choke knew this kid wasn't from Boston.
He just knew that.
It was just like you do not cross that border. This is Choke's stage, Boston crew only.
So was that the end of the set at that point, or is it just?
I have a fantasy where that's the end of the set. Like the music magically stops. Yeah. Those guys like get in the van as quickly as possible and speed away without even collecting their money. But chances are it was probably less dramatic than that.
Yeah, 3 more awkward songs, and then they got in their van and left.
Probably they finished the set. Choke might have even apologized to him and hugged him or something. I have my own sort of fantasy of Last Rites is that it was a much more sort of like this horrible vicious act that was never apologized for. When in fact it probably wasn't that big a deal.
So at this point, I guess like the only other band I really want to find out is just for my own personal perversion. But Vile, did you ever see Vile live?
Yes, and I'm trying to remember.
Maybe opening for Anti Nowhere League.
Was it Anti Nowhere League or the Cockney Rejects? I can't remember. They got one like really like ridiculously plum gig that they got. Like this is part of the reason why everybody was down on Vile, because unlike the Freeze, who had been eating shit and putting on their own shows for years, unlike SSD, who like did it the right way, whatever, from the ground up, Vile just kind of came out of nowhere. It was like all of a sudden Vile have a record and they have a show at the channel opening for it may have been Anti Nowhere League. I'm thinking it may have been someone else. I mean, I wish I could.
I think they only played as far as I know, like they played like 2 Boston shows or 2 or 3 Boston shows, and that was kind of it for their run.
Yeah, I'm typing now. You hear the sound of me googling this stuff. This is pathetic. This, my friends, is why you shouldn't smoke weed.
No, this is why you should smoke weed, because it makes the discovery for the second time all the more exciting.
I mean, I'm just saying, it's like I could, I should be able to remember a historic occasion this without resorting to Google. But
well, I think marijuana's maybe blessed you by letting you forget this memory.
Okay, well, anyway, Vile played the show at the channel, opening for someone really. It was a gig that like 7 other bands really wanted and didn't get. And the channel at the time was booked by a guy named Warren Scott, who was not like down with the punk scene or whatever. He was pretty much like a straight businessman, rock biz dude. And he wasn't. I wouldn't say he was a bad guy. I mean, he certainly let me do a lot of business with the channel when they had no business. They had no no reason to do anything with it with a child. But Warren was probably the kind of guy who, if you were like, I don't know, like a biz manager or whatever, and hassled him enough, he would probably throw you a bone on, say, like a Cockney Reject show or an Angel Upstart show or whatever, rather than like, I don't know, like scour the zine to try to figure out who deserved the show the most. Like, Warren was not a guy that you would see like at like a Gallery East show or whatever, checking out new bands who could play his club. He was more into kind of like working with booking agents and cherry picking whatever. So the short version of this, sorry for the lack of details, that Vile got some gigantic gig that no one wanted them on and no one wanted to see them. They played this channel show. They were considered horrible. People were throwing stuff at them. They tried throwing records into the crowd, maybe to appease the crowd in some fashion. A lot of those records ended up in the parking lot being trashed and run over. So yeah, it was a fairly inauspicious start and finish to Vile's career.
And now it's just a footnote too. But that was only for, I think the only person that cares about hearing that is me. But maybe through 3 other people. So at like what point? Is this around the time you decided to move to New York? You drop out of school?
No, that was a couple of years earlier.
Oh, you went back to see Vile.
The Vile thing is an earlier era. I went to UMass Amherst to go to school, and I promptly dropped out after 4 months. I did not do very well academically. I believe the only class I got a passing grade in was Spanish 1, which I was taking for the 3rd time. So it's a little getting a B- in Spanish 1 when you're taking it for the 3rd time is not very hard. But yeah, I did terrible academically, mostly because I didn't bother going to classes. I mean, I just didn't go at all. I was pretty much spending every day sleeping late, buying records, hanging out with friends, going to the record store, getting in the car and driving to New York. things that were not really part of the traditional curriculum. I was doing a radio show at WMUA, the Amherst radio station, and flunked out, as it were, and came back to Massachusetts, puttered around the western suburbs for a while longer. Had kind of a boiler room job doing telephone solicitations. Had a couple of jobs like that. Mm-hmm. Put out that compilation record that you referred to, the Bands That Could Be God record. And it was a little while after that record came out that I got a call from a dude named Sam Berger. Sam I'd known from the Boston area. Sam used to work at a used record store on Newbury Street called Rebop Records, which was a great used record store. Really important store for me. It was one of the first record stores I ever went to where the guys at the store would give me shit for what I was buying.
A rite of passage.
You know, it's like, do you really want to buy a Jam record? Hasn't anyone ever told you that the Jams suck? When are you going to start listening to real music? When are you? I mean, if I had listened to those guys, if I had actually paid attention to anything they were trying to tell me in like 1982 or 83, I could have been listening to the MC5 and the Groundhogs and Son.
Yeah.
But I'm like, you guys have any Human League records?
But like, you know, what would you be into now if you were listening to the Groundhogs then? You know, like there's only so many places you can go.
I think you know what, that I think you can go all over. I think you could go anywhere. I think you can go anywhere. I don't think there's like a, you know, it's funny. My dad once said something to me when I was I don't know, maybe 14 or 15, and I was complaining that I couldn't see shows. You know, I was like, there's all these shows I want to see and check out, and for all these reasons I can't do it. And my dad was like, yeah, but you know, you do understand that if you got to do all this stuff right now, you do understand that you'd get bored with it, you'd get burnt out. And, you know, what would you be interested in when you were 20?
That's true, but you never got burnt out on it.
And I did get burnt out, but not for many years later.
Really? Because I would say that you're one of the few people I know that still goes to shows for pleasure, that works in the music industry.
Yeah, I definitely go to shows for pleasure. I don't go because of the music industry.
No, it has nothing to, like, I've seen you in shows in Austin that were bands that you would, you know, they'd be light years before they'd be on Matador type thing, and you're just there because you like them as a band.
Well, that is what I do. That is what I do for fun. And, you know, it's like I don't have, you know, quote unquote family. I don't have expensive record buying aside. I don't have any expensive hobbies. And, so yeah, that is what I do for fun, and I don't have any regrets about that. There's certainly, I think there was definitely a period, probably towards the end of the 1990s, that I stopped going to see as much live music and probably stopped buying as many records, for a variety of reasons. Not because there weren't good things going on culturally, but I probably had a lot of frustration with the music,
other situations,
with probably frustration with the music business and trying to figure out what any of it actually had to do with me. And I did eventually come to the conclusion that it had nothing to do with me, and that I should just try to enjoy what's good and not really give a shit about where all the pieces fit. But yeah, I think there definitely was a period where I probably got a little burnt out, not so much on music, but on a lot of the trappings. I think living in New York, going to shows that were heavily populated by a lot of people in the music business, I think living in London, where it's similar to that, there were a lot of things that kind of turned me off about going to shows where a large portion of the audience has gotten in for free, a large portion of the audience clearly doesn't want to be there. And rather than use that as motivation to try to find something else, you know, like the show where everyone does want to be there, the show that someone put on for the right reasons, I think my attitude was to try to, you know, well, you know what, maybe I need a break. Maybe I need to, maybe this whole thing is kind of eating itself. But I was wrong. I was absolutely wrong. I think there's definitely a period certainly a period in American underground music that's like a big sort of blank spot for me because I just stopped looking.
Yeah, well, I think that always, you know, like you need that time to step away, I guess, before you can come back and be reinvigorated by the passion for it. Now that just means you have an entire world of Fat Records releases that you can discover every day.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, all the Lookout and Fat stuff that you missed out on.
It's like there's that whole, you know, there's like a whole decade of Bridge 9 records I haven't listened to.
Exactly. There's a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff. Well, I guess, like, you know, you're talking about what got you into the whole evil music industry. So you got the call to kind of work for, it was called LSR, or was it already Homestead?
No, it was already Homestead. LSR was the parent company. I mean, God, there's so many stupid names. There's LS. Well, Lawrence Sultan Records. LSR is the incorporation. LSR.
Yeah. But isn't that the name on the back of the big black record?
Yeah,
instead of Homestead?
LSR is the parent.
Okay.
Whatever. Copyright LSR.
Okay.
So yeah, Lord Sultan Records, and then Lord Sultan Records owns Dutch East India Trading, which is the distribution company, and Homestead Records was the in-house label of
Dutch East
Trading. So I knew Sam because he worked at Rebop, and he played in a Boston band called the Wayouts. And I think the only Way Out show I ever saw was them being fronted by Dread Fool, Dan Ireton, who now lives in Western Mass.
Dread Fool in the Din, right?
Yeah,
is the name?
Yeah, he's made a lot of great records on his own. Records with Ben Chasney. He's really Chris Corsano. He's really I mean, yeah, incredible, great singer, great, really amazing mind. Still making music today. But so Dan was fronting this band called the Way Outs, which Sam played guitar for, and so I kind of knew Sam through all that stuff. And Sam had moved to New York and became the buyer, the domestic buyer for Dutch East India Trading. And when I say domestic buyer, he was the guy who would be buying like 7 inches and records and zines and whatever from people on consignment, and then helping them get paid later on. So Sam started carrying Conflict for Dutch East India Trading, which was a big deal because at the time my distribution was like incredibly limited. I would just bring it to record stores in the Boston area. I would bring it to gigs or whatever. And now all of a sudden there was like a real distributor trying to sell it to record stores.
What was your circulation kind of around then? Sorry, I know it's like a bit.
It was in the middle period. It was probably only 400 or 500 per issue, but towards the very end, it was getting up around 2,000 or so.
Yeah.
So it was definitely getting around a lot more towards the end, but yeah. So anyway, so Dutch East India Trading is carrying the zine, and so I get to talk on the phone with Sam every now and then. And Sam was a good guy. Sam would like let me buy records from Dutch East at like whatever store prices. Mm-hmm. So whatever, I would like be buying like records from Australia or whatever for like a pretty good discount. And anyway, he's got a label. They essentially are going to start a record label at Dutch East India. They've had labels before, but they're going to start a new label that he's going to run, and he's going to find bands. And they're going to make the records with their own money, and then he's going to take the tapes, put the records out. They're going to deduct the costs of mastering, print, whatever, pay him a royalty. It's going to be kind of a real budget operation. But he's got his own label, and the first band he signed was a Boston band called the Blackjacks, fronted by Johnny Angel, who had previously played guitar for the Thrills, which Merle Allen played bass for many years.
Oh, wow, I had no idea.
Signed a local garage rock band called the Dogmatics.
Yeah.
And of some interest to me, he began to sign a bunch of bands I was either fans of or friends with. He signed Great Plains from Columbus, Ohio, who I was a fan of. He signed Salem 66, really, really great Boston trio who...
And they're on your comp, too, right?
Yeah, big fan of. He made a deal with Steve Albini to license some Big Black records. He made a deal with Naked Reagan to license the Throb Throb record, and he also made a deal with a singer-songwriter from Mississippi, Tim Lee, to put out the Windbreakers records. And I mean, these were all people who I knew. These were all people whose records I'd been buying and had a real interest in, and really kind of like almost immediately, like very shortly after the label got started, the first 2 records that come out, Sam left. He went to take a job working for Midnight Records in Manhattan. And the way
the garage rock label, Midnight Records,
record store and the label. And the way Sam explained it to me was, he didn't like commuting to Long Island, and it was going to be more fun to work in the record store. And I don't know if he was being entirely straight with me, but that's what he said was going on. And he's like, do you have any interest in applying for the job? And it's like, do I have any interest in applying for the job? And it's like, sure, how much do I have to pay them? So I go to New York, and I go to Long Island, and I have the interview with Barry, the owner, and he, seems kind of amused by me. It doesn't really say too much. And then a couple of days after the interview, they're like, "Do you want the job?" So that's kind of how it happened. It was.
So that's how you moved down to New York. Yeah. Like you got the job and then you moved for the job.
Exactly. Yeah. And it wasn't until much later that I found out they'd offered the job to like 6 other people. I mean, I was constantly meeting other people in the music business who were like, "Yeah, they offered me that job. Money sucked." I said no.
When you were coming down there, did you already have ideas of bands you wanted to work with?
Oh, yeah, like immediately. I had like a list of like 100 bands. It was nuts. It was completely nuts. I mean, they essentially, because the risk was rather low for Homestead, and they needed to have a steady flow of product. and there was not really any plans to spend any real money on promotion or marketing or materials or to hire any extra staff, I was kind of given carte blanche to do whatever the fuck I wanted to. And I'd say that was probably good and bad in equal measure. Mostly bad, because it was too many records, and some of them didn't sell that well, and obviously there were bookkeeping disasters that have been long chronicled. On the good side, a lot of pretty cool records came out that might not have existed otherwise.
Yeah, I was going to say, what was your first record you brought to them? Well, like, what the first, like, I was going to say, was it SSD Break It Up, but it must have been before that.
No, that was a couple of years later. Maybe The Flies.
The Flies, yeah, okay.
The Flies Get Wise record, which...
Or the Meatmen? Was the Meatmen you?
The Meatmen was me, but that was later on. That unfortunately did not go very well. Tesco did not care for... I didn't handle that particularly well. I mean, that was one of the very few deals where Homestead actually paid in advance and was actually trying to be halfway competitive with the record commercially. And although by Homestead standards it was a success, the record did not do nearly as well as Tesco would have liked. And I think he was very, very frustrated with just, like a lack of progress and the label's lack of professionalism. And I mean, I remember, I would try to get him like sales figures, and somebody in the warehouse would be like, well, we shipped this many, blah, blah, blah. So I'd say to Tesco, well, we've sold this many. And like you get his accounting, and it would say, well, you've only sold like, half that many. And
you shipped that many.
He'd get Lyle Presler on the phone to the boss man, and they'd start arguing, and it was awful. It was awful.
Yeah.
I desperately wanted to do right by him. I mean, Tesco was like, without question, a hero of mine at that point in time. One of the funniest people I've ever met. Fantastic writer, great taste, amazing guy, and did a pretty shitty job for him.
Yeah, but I think that, you were obviously pretty young in this music industry at that point, right? Like, that's fairly early on in your tenure, isn't it? Like,
still,
85?
I mean, regardless. I mean, it did say in the contract, the guy running the label is 20 years old, so it's okay if we fuck up and take 2 years to pay you, And the deal, none of that stuff matters. None of that stuff should matter at all. I mean, I should not have been cut any slack for that, and but yeah, at the same time, it's like whatever. I don't want to get too defensive about it. I mean, Homestead was not a very good label. I think I can say that with.
Well, from a business standpoint, I think you should say that. But I think from a creative standpoint, it's an amazing label.
Well, I mean, and the thing is, from a business standpoint, I don't think it's nearly as bad a label as it's been made out to be.
Yeah, like I mean, from an accounting point of view,
it certainly became a worse label after it folded. If such a thing is possible. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when the label did exist, there were certainly bookkeeping mistakes. There were certainly inaccuracies. There were definitely a couple of things that happened that I would say were unethical. But people eventually did get paid, even though it took a very, very long time. The sort of stuff that happened later on, after the fact, when people would try to get their records back, none of that stuff is excusable on any level. And
but you were gone by that point.
Yeah, but whatever. Yeah. It's like I can't. I was gone at that point. But the fact of the matter is, there was a bunch of bands who came into the fold because I asked them to make records. And the fact that I'm no longer part of the company doesn't excuse the fact that I got them in the hot water. So,
but it's kind of funny because you look at all the big labels in that kind of period, like SST or Homestead. A lot of them had that same sort of problem in the end, where the records have been kept, and bands have had a hard time getting their records back and their masters back.
Yeah, and again, I can't comment on the situation with SST.
Yeah,
but, I mean, there's not a week or a month that goes by that somebody who recorded for Homestead doesn't contact me and say, "Hey, how do I get my stuff back? What do I have to do? Do you have the tapes?
Yeah.
Do you have?" I'm like, "No, I don't have anything, man. I didn't own the place. I was an employee." and I give them the best detective tools I can to help them out, but there's not a ton I can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, imagine now it's like what Dutch East Indies folded in 95, 96?
I don't remember the exact year, but yeah, they've been on the shelf for a while, and
put it over a lot of
Magnet did a big piece a couple of years ago about the various efforts people have made to try to reissue their own material and get their parts back.
I was going to say though, I forget it. Not important. Not important at all. Well, out of the Homestead records, is there any band that you felt never really got its due that should have? Because there's like a lot of bands that have gone on, Nick Cave, obviously, and like Sonic Youth, Dino, Swans, that have gone on to like huge things. But were there any bands that you felt like maybe because of the number of records that were coming out didn't really get their opportunity to find that audience for that record?
Yeah, I mean, probably a ton. I mean, Breaking Circus, those Breaking Circus records I think are absolutely incredible. And I'm not sure it was entirely Homestead's fault they didn't find their audience, but yeah, I mean, those records certainly come to mind. Other than that, I'm sure there's loads of others. I mean, I think it's interesting to me how many people today lionize the label and talk about it in kind of hushed tones, like it's this classic American independent label, because at the time it was not treated that way.
Yeah.
At the time, we really, really had to struggle for press coverage and any kind of commercial acceptance. And indie rock, as you might call it, was not in vogue. I mean, in that era, this was not music people were looking to either change the world or get paid. I mean, the fact of the matter is, the guy who owned the company looked at it as something as like an albatross / embarrassment. I mean, the reason he kept starting other record labels and kept putting money into other companies was because he felt that Homestead had no real future. So, so it's hard to say. I mean, I'm there's definitely records I'm proud of. I'm glad they came out. I wish they'd come out a little better. I think probably that first not the first, but the Frogs Only Right Natural would be the record that I'm probably the most proud of in terms of, maybe had to twist on someone's arm to make that record come out. Probably had to put up with a lot of fallout in terms of people getting angry with me personally for that record existing. But the number of people who I know today who like that's their favorite record, I feel pretty good about that.
Well, it's Frogs and Conflict Zine are like two things that like you talk to certain people that have certain, I would describe as good taste, but other people might say terrible taste. But like certain people, like it's almost like a cult of cool. Conflict's funny because like I was a generation after Conflict, so I didn't get to really read it as it was coming out. But the stuff that I grew up like really into, like Chunklet or like The Best Show and stuff like that. Those, Tom and Henry are both like students of Conflict Zine and self-professed huge fans of Conflict Zine and stuff like that. So it's like almost like Conflict is the Frogs of the zine world.
Yeah, I can live with that.
Equally offensive.
Conflict is the fake gay twin brothers of the of the zine world.
Exactly.
Fake gay supremacist twin brothers of the zine world. Yeah.
I want to like, obviously we've been talking for a super long time, and I don't want to keep you any longer. But like, I have a whole chunk of questions doing with New York. Do you want to come back and do that? And can I just wrap up talking to you about some Conflict questions?
Yeah, sure.
I have?
Whatever you want.
Yeah, because that way, like, because I could honestly. We're through one page of my questions, and I have like 4 more of just New York stuff. So We'll do that another time. But like, thank you so much for doing this. It's been awesome. But I wanted to talk to you about Conflict Zine and like, what was that doing a zine at that point, especially a zine. You were almost like the OG cynical punk rocker, like the guy that was over it. Like, I guess you, Touch and Go zine, I kind of had the same attitude, but like sort of an idea that like, this music should be so much more than being codified to just like 3-chord punk rock, right? At that time, was that something you felt right away? Like you never felt punk rock should be just like your one focus? Were you always kind of open to different types of music?
I think the earliest days of the zine were incredibly unfocused. The writing is completely embarrassing and awful. musically it's not very focused or very there's not really a strong musical point of view. I mean, I think the early days of Conflict are pretty embarrassing and shitty in every way, shape, and form. I think later on, as the voice.
These are like super nerdy, but like, how did you even reproduce it at that point? Like, did you have access to a mimeograph, or what were you using?
No, I would go to Xerox shops. I would go to various Xerox shops in the suburbs or in Boston. And
I guess there's a lot with this. So many universities, there must be a ton of them in Boston.
Yeah, and it wasn't cheap, but you would hunt around and try to find the cheapest price.
Mm-hmm.
Who could do it the right way. And
it's amazing because the same sort of like, I guess skills that you kind of were part of the generation that put into place were the same skills that I was using when I was doing my zine, 15 years later, 16 years later, when I was, going to copy shops trying to find the best price and stuff like that.
Well, it's funny because I did, eventually as the thing got bigger and there were more readers and there needed to be an effort to do it differently, I would find offset printers. Mm-hmm. And that was a completely different set of whatever layout issues and, but yeah, it was all, it's very, very primitive by modern standards, and the whole like typesetting. What the fuck? You try to explain to someone what typesetting is now, they look at you like you're like,
yeah,
you're from outer space. I mean, it's weird. I did these small sort of like PDF versions of Conflict this year and last year, just I guess kind of to see what it would be like to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because my first thought was, well, I'm just going to print these and give them to friends. And then after I looked at it and figured how much it would cost, I was like, what, I'm just going to put it up a PDF and put it up online. People can print it out themselves if they want. And it was funny because, I mean, some people were like, a few people were happy about it, but a number of people were like, why don't you print it? Why don't you print it? Fuck this PDF shit. And I thought that was great. I thought that was great that people were actually like, they were
angered by it.
They were angry that you had to read it online. I thought I wish I'm glad somebody was bothered by that.
Did you ever have like anyone call you on any of the stuff you wrote, like especially in the early years when you were like a younger kid, show up at shows and have?
Yeah, absolutely. People, I mean, you definitely get a lot of mail, and occasionally, very occasionally, like confrontations in public with people. I mean, that stuff happened. Happened more than a few times, definitely.
And it was still like, you're like, I'm just going to keep going the way I'm doing this zine. Like, that was the awesome thing about it. It become, you say it's unfocused in the very beginning, but
actually, no, there were a couple of occasions where I apologized. I mean, there was one, somebody just asked me about this the other day. There was an incident, God, I can't remember, but this is like well into adulthood. During the Dutch East era, when I was still doing, kind of doing the zine again, Conflict Mark II. I don't know if you remember Patrick's zine.
I don't know. What was Patrick's zine
Patrick
called?
Had a zine called Too Fun, Too Huge.
Oh, he's told me about it, but I've never actually seen it.
Really great magazine. They had two issues, but both really good. And I think it was in the first issue of Too Fun, Too Huge, they printed a rather profane bit of poetry about Mike Gitter.
Okay.
And I don't know if you remember Mike.
I know of Mike Gitter, yeah.
Yes, they ran something very nasty about Mike. I believe the author still needs to remain anonymous. It wasn't Patrick, but anyway, Mike was pretty upset when this thing got published, and there was a local record store in Boston that a number of the people at the store were friends of Mike, and they decided not to carry Patrick's zine as a result.
Okay.
And I, in my infinite wisdom, wrote something in Conflict along the lines of, well, these guys are not carrying Patrick's zine because they're kissing Mike Gitter's ass, and the next time you visit the store, you might just want to urinate on the counter. So I wrote that, perhaps not remembering that the record store was actually customers of Dutch East India Trading, and I was an employee of Dutch East India Trading. And when the store saw this and announced to their salesperson at Dutch East that they would no longer be buying records from Dutch East, my boss was not very happy with me and made it very clear that I needed to apologize to these folks. And I did, hat in hand, visit them, actually fly to Boston and go to the store and personally eat shit and apologize to the owner and try to explain to him in my own way, trying in some way to save face. Like, well, this is the kind of thing we do in the zine. We kid around a lot. When I say things like piss on the counter, I don't really mean piss on the counter. I just mean that in the sort of figure, it's a, and the whole time the guy's just giving me this look like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you.
So, was there any interview where you had that, like, starting it so young, where you had this sort of like demystification process? I think everyone that does any sort of interviews with bands has that one interview where you do that interview and you're like, oh, these people are just as fucked up as we are, type thing.
It varied. It really, really varied. I mean, to this day, I'm amazed at how patient and how nice most of the bands I interviewed for the zine were. I mean, they were clearly dealing with an inarticulate, unknowledgeable adolescent. And many of them took the process as seriously as they would have if they were being interviewed by the NME or the New York Times. And conversely, I'm also amazed how many of them, did the sort of the sulky, fuck you, we don't care thing, when they're clearly talking to a kid who's a fan of theirs.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like both of those things are totally legit. I mean, I definitely respect the fact that, there are musicians who, were some of my favorites of all time who, indulged me in this goofy thing. And I also totally respect the fact that there are some of them who are like, fuck you, what kind of question is that? Who the fuck do you think you are? I think all of those things are really, really, really great. I mean, yeah, I mean, there were definitely a couple of times that like things happened in interviews. People would hang up or walk out or get upset or whatever, and the things like that would happen. I mean, there was a time that was trying to do an interview with the Circle Jerks, and they were playing the channel, and I met up with those guys at Soundcheck, and we got in the van, and we're driving back to their hotel, something in Revere or somewhere, and there's this horrible, horrible traffic jam, horrible Boston rush hour traffic on the highway. Like, it's like 100 fucking degrees, and the van is not moving, and like I'm in the van with these guys, and they clearly don't want me there. It's like they're like, who the hell is this guy? Why is he in our van? And the van is not moving. I'm there with a friend of mine. We're doing the interview together, and nothing's going on, and there's dead silence. And finally, at one point, Keith Morris just like very casually, like, opens up this porno mag and starts furiously rubbing at the front of his shorts, and leans over to us and says, "So, you guys looking forward to Grease 2 coming out?"
Yeah, I've been on tour with Keith, and I can see him still doing something like that.
And it's like that's pretty,
Oh, it's awesome! What an amazing
yes, Grease 2. Can't wait. When is opening day for Grease 2? So yeah, I mean, yeah, things like that would happen every now and then, and
that made you the man you are today.
I guess. I mean, it does amaze me that people were so patient.
Well, I'll let you go because we have talked for forever, and I want to talk next time about like G.G. Allen. Were you Rob Zombie's roommate for a while too?
We weren't roommates. I lived in a basement, quote unquote studio, which is a nice word for a bunch of bricks with no windows. But yeah, there was a series of studios on 13th Street in a basement between 1st and 2nd Avenue. And I lived in the room in back, and Rob and Sean lived in the room in front. And
oh man,
it would definitely be an exaggeration to say we were roommates, but I mean we were certainly close friends
neighbors
at the time.
Yeah.
And we were certainly living in pretty close quarters, so I guess it would be more analogous to saying it was kind of like we were dorm mates, except we weren't going to school, and the conditions were much worse than a dorm.
Yeah, you're going to the School of Hard Knocks on the LES.
Absolutely.
Well, Gerard, thanks so much. I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay.
And right once.
And thus ends part 1 with Gerard Cosloy. Now, hopefully in the future, as I say, we will have Gerard back on the show to go into part 2, playing with Gigi Allen. I'm really, really excited to hear more stories from that era because he's got some amazing ones that I forced him to tell me at Matador parties over the years. Thank you very much once again for downloading. Please head over to DamienAbraham.com to get in touch. I don't really have anything to plug. I guess I'm going to be in Australia in March for the Soundwave tour, and that's really about it for plugs right now. But yeah, hey, thanks for listening, and go out there, make something, start a fanzine, start a record label, start a band. Hell, anyone can do it. If I'm doing it, any of you can do it. Anyway, see you next week. Oh, yeah, next week on the show, continuing in this kind of like little trend of people that got into this music super young, we are going to be interviewing probably the guy with the most legit youth cred any punk rock person can have. Steve McDonald from the band Red Cross and Off will be on the show. He also played in Tenacious D. He also played in Beck. He also, oh man, his credentials go far, far and very wide. He's also led a pretty insanely crazy, bizarre, wow life. We'll get into that next week on the episode. It's a must-listen-to episode, so must-listen-to, in fact, that we had to record it twice. We'll get into that next week as well. Oh, I guess also you can check out the Vice documentary that I did over there on YouTube, Canadian Cannabis. I guess before we go any further, thank you to Jordan for letting me use the Millennial Rain song as the theme song. Thank you to Rode for the microphones. I'm using them a lot, as you guys can tell. Also, thank you to Brian, Kim, and Zach for all your help on the website. And thank you to you for downloading. And hey, we'll see you next week. Bye.